officials in a meeting at the White House that they would need to deliver, quote, specific investigations in order to secure the White House meeting they so desired with President Trump. Now, that's according to Vindman's opening statement that was reported yesterday. But the fact that the $400 million in aid, including that desperately needed military assistance to beat back the Russians, that was also being used by the president. That didn't become clear until the next month, Vindman testified yesterday. And after then National Security Advisor John Bolton told Vindman to prepare a decision memo by August 15th for Bolton and other senior administration officials to present as a Trump administration-wide interagency argument to President Trump to release the assistance funds to Ukraine as soon as possible. Vindman wrote that memo, wrote that argument, and a day later, Bolton, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Secretary of Defense Mike Esper, and other national security officials met with President Trump at his resort in Bedminster. After they met in Bedminster, Vindman learned that President Trump was still refusing to allow those funds to go to Ukraine, and that convinced Lieutenant Colonel Vindman that President Trump was still waiting for the, quote, deliverable, as Bill Taylor, the top diplomat in Ukraine, referred to it in his deposition, the deliverable, the announcement of an investigation into the Bidens that Ukrainian officials needed to deliver in order to get the money they so desperately needed. Our team of reporters is on this story, and we have some even more breaking news right now. John Bolton has been officially asked to testify for the impeachment inquiry. Caitlin Collins, tell us about that.
Yeah, he's been asked to testify next week on November the 7th. House impeachment investigators have invited the former national security advisor, who has been famously silent as all of this is ramped up. So the issues surrounding, of course, this call, a call that John Bolton was not on, but that his deputy instead was on, someone who is in kind of a bind of his own, deciding whether or not he's going to appear. So right now we don't know if John Bolton is going to appear. They have not issued a subpoena for him to appear yet, but right now that is an invitation that has been made, and the question is he going to take them up on it? And if he does, what does he say? That would be incredibly significant for all of this because, of course, we've seen all of these people going and testifying on Capitol Hill. Not a lot of them have had interactions directly with President Trump. John Bolton, of course, is someone who is in the Oval Office almost every day. And while he and the president soured in their relationship at the end, he knows a lot because he was at the center of this fight over this military aid with Mick Mulvaney. He's not the only one, though. There have been two other big invitations. That's for John Eisenberg, who is the lawyer for the National Security Council, who has also found himself in the middle of this because he was someone who several staffers who had issues with the president's July phone call went and spoke with him about. He's also another person that he and the National Security Council legal team, the White House has pinned the blame on for moving that transcript of the president's call to that highly secure system.
Rough transcript.
Yes, rough transcript, not exact, as we have since learned from that testimony yesterday. And there's one more, Michael Ellis, that is his deputy there, who of course has come under the spotlight of his own at times because he used to work for the House Intelligence Committee when Nunes was in charge of it. He was facing accusations about letting the White House review classified information. So those are three big asks. We're waiting to see what it is they say.
Exactly. Bolton has a lot to contribute. I suspect he's not going to testify unless he's subpoenaed. But let's talk about what Vindman said, because Vindman said yesterday in his deposition, CNN has just broken this news, that he became convinced that this aid, $400 million, much of it was military aid for Ukraine, that President Trump was withholding it until the Ukrainians publicly announced that the Bidens were going to be investigated. And a lot of this is wrapped up in this August memo. You have more reporting on that August memo, which was basically making the argument to the President Trump, we need to release these funds.
Well, look, I think one of the issues here is that the administration has sort of said there were all these legitimate reasons for why the president was not releasing this money. And as you are reporting, and Kylie has done a lot of great reporting on this, there actually was a push to get the president to sign on the dotted line and release the money in August. And it came from some of the top administration officials that since then, the White House has pinned the blame on for holding back this money. So we've seen as witness after witness goes before the impeachment investigators, this narrative that the White House and the Office of Management and Budget tried to create around this freeze has really begun to crumble. And it seems more and more like this decision to freeze the money and then to release the money rested solely on the whims of President Trump.
And Kylie, you covered the State Department for us. You're reporting that the president's decision in June to freeze these funds unnerved a lot of senior administration officials.
Yeah, so we're hearing today from one of the State Department officials who was involved in U.S.-Ukraine policy quite directly. She was one of the assistants to Kurt Volker, and she is telling lawmakers today, according to her prepared testimony, her opening remarks that we obtained, that she was on that July 18th interagency discussion in which the announcement was made that there was going to be this hold on this security assistance. And during that phone call, they said that it was at the direction of President Trump. This gets back to the heart of what Sarah was just saying, is that, the OMB was announcing that there was the hold. We're told that it was OMB who was doing the review, that the Pentagon was also doing a review. But ultimately, day one, they were told that it was President Trump who was directing the hold. And Catherine Croft is someone who knows Ukraine well. She knew that Rudy Giuliani was intimately involved in this smear campaign against Ambassador Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador there. So the U.S. State Department officials were very concerned when they first heard about this hold and really had questions about the legitimacy of it.
And Sarah, you've previously reported about 6 sources telling CNN that Republican Senator Rob Portman, a Republican of Ohio, made one last pitch to President Trump in the September 11th phone call, urging him to release these funds.
That's right. This is a point where basically everyone else in the administration is saying, okay, it's time to release this money. The president still won't budge. Rob Portman decides he's going to take one more go at it. He calls the president and essentially says, if you don't get this money out the door, essentially now, it's going to go away because the fiscal year is ending, and then you're going to have a potentially even bigger problem on your hands. And, they hung up the call, and the president really surprised everyone around him, everyone in Washington, and even everyone in Ukraine, because he decided after that call that he was going to release the money. Now, we don't know ultimately if Rob Portman's pitch was the one that put the president over the edge, or if it was this mounting pressure that he was getting from lawmakers and even within his own administration. But we do know that he released the money after that, and this is something impeachment investigators very much want the answer to.
It's also possible that the president, correct me if I'm wrong, Caitlin, had heard about this whistleblower and the fact that he or she had lodged a complaint, was expressing concerns about this rogue Ukraine policy and the fact that military aid and other aid was being held up to force this investigation of the Bidens. We don't know when President Trump learned about this.
No, we don't know. There's still a lot of mystery surrounding the timeline exactly when it comes to that. But we do know that this person, before going and filing this complaint, went to an attorney beforehand and talked about this, talked about their concern, the concern that they had heard from people before they went and filed this complaint. So there is a chance that the White House was more aware than we have initially believed. Whether the president was aware, that's really the question. But also, this has really been something that has kind of consumed the president so far. He talks about it constantly, all the time, wanting to know the identity of this whistleblower because he believes it's just someone who has essentially a bone to pick with him. And those are really his questions that have focused on the identity of the whistleblower.
And let me just ask you briefly, there is this huge campaign to smear Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who fought for the United States, is an American citizen, has shrapnel because he was still in his body because he was hit by an IED when he was in combat operations for the U.S. in Iraq. Going after him as a dual citizen, going after him as like some sort of covert agent for Ukraine, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anybody in the White House who's concerned, like, boy, this really looks bad? Even Liz Cheney is saying that this is shameful.
That was something everyone was paying attention to in the White House. We talked to several people about it yesterday because it wasn't just Liz Cheney. She was the first, and a lot of people were surprised that she came out so forcefully about that. But also John Thune and Mitch McConnell later on talking about these criticisms of someone who was just simply, they believe, telling what happened in his position in that role. Of course, he is incredibly sensitive for the White House because he is the first person to testify that was actually on that call. That's why you saw people trying to discredit him, even though he is someone who has served in the military, was wounded, and essentially people in the White House have said they didn't think that was a great idea.
My sources say that he reported to work today at the National Security Council, even after all of this. All right, thanks one and all for being here and reporting on all this. There's a ton going on today. Right now, another Foreign Service officer is testifying before House investigators. This is lawmakers are right now debating impeachment inquiry rules ahead of a full House vote tomorrow. Lots of debate about that. And then on the other side of the country, winds more than 70 miles per hour, fueling multiple fires across California. We're going to go live there as well. Stay with us.
The Lead with Jake Tapper.
The House Rules Committee is debating the House resolution the Democrats introduced that will be voted on tomorrow, which will outline the process of the impeachment inquiry going forward. This comes as a source tells CNN that a star witness for House Democrats is willing to return to Capitol Hill and testify in public. That's Bill Taylor, the top U.S. diplomat in Ukraine. He delivered some of the most damning testimony yet, as did Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman yesterday. And today, 2 more witnesses are giving their accounts behind closed doors. As CNN's Sunland Sarfati reports, their testimonies could back up damaging depositions already on the record.
2 new witnesses testifying on Capitol Hill today in the House Democrats' intensifying impeachment probe. Christopher Anderson, aide to former Special Envoy for Ukraine Kurt Volker, speaking to lawmakers behind closed doors, telling lawmakers about the concerns voiced by former National Security Advisor John Bolton over Rudy Giuliani's shadow Ukraine operation. Anderson, according to his opening statement obtained by CNN, saying Bolton cautioned Mr. Giuliani was a key voice with the president on Ukraine, which could be an obstacle to increased White House engagement. Catherine Croft, a State Department special advisor for Ukraine, also appearing today, corroborating the testimony the committees have heard from other witnesses about the push to oust the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch. Meantime, the fallout continues from the explosive testimony on Capitol Hill Tuesday of Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, the National Security Council's top Ukraine expert. Vindman was on the now famous July 25th call between President Trump and the Ukrainian president, the same call President Trump refers to as perfect.
You take a look at that call, it was perfect.
But Vindman's testimony directly contradicting President Trump's public description of the transcript released by the White House.
I had a transcript done by very, very talented people, word for word, comma for comma, done by people that do it for a living. We had an exact transcript.
President Trump touting over and over again that it was an exact transcript of the phone call. The White House in September saying the ellipses that showed up did not represent missing words or phrases. But not so, says Vindman, who told lawmakers what the White House released was not exact and had at least 2 parts omitted, a reference to a Joe Biden tape and a specific mention of Burisma, the company where Biden's son Hunter was on the board. Burisma, according to Vindman, appearing in the transcript as just the company.
Meantime, back on Bill Taylor being willing to publicly testify up here on Capitol Hill. Sources say that an official request has not been yet made by the committees, but certainly, Jake, many Democrats up here on Capitol Hill would think he would really make an ideal first witness as this inquiry enters into its next, more public phase. Jake?
All right, Sunland Sarfati on Capitol Hill, thanks so much. Let's chew over all this with our experts. Democrats believe that Bill Taylor is going to be an unassailable witness. Democratic Congresswoman Jackie Speer, who's on the House Intelligence Committee, said, quote, he's rock solid, detailed note taker, unimpeachable, 50 years given to his country, doesn't get much more Top Gun than that. But Mary Catherine, I mean, you and I might think it's unassailable, but the White House and the president have been assailing. I mean, President Trump called him a never-Trumper, no evidence that he is, and then said never-Trumpers are human scum. I mean, they've been going after him. I
mean, yes, they will attempt to assail him. The Democrats have the advantage right at the moment of the fact that both Taylor and Vindman, as far as I can tell, A, seem to have very solid backgrounds and reputations, but B, Trump has a way of making his adversaries and anyone who speaks up against him occasionally or frequently act as insane and erratic as he does. Mm-hmm. These two have yet to shift themselves and act openly partisan or mess up in public. And so that is giving them credibility. And if they continue to do that, then it will be a problem for Trump.
But I think so. My theory on this, and I've talked to folks on the Hill, and they've verified that the whole strategy here, right, is Schiff, as a former federal prosecutor, he is building this case brick by brick. And as we've gone along, it has gotten more damning, more evidence, more. And the whole goal was that when we get to the public part, it's intentionally going to seem like this is the worst of the worst for the president. So they can keep trying to assail, but the point is the evidence is building and building. And even though we haven't heard from those Republicans who are sitting in those same hearings, they know what these people have said in private. They know the damage that could be done when they get a chance to talk in public. And so at some point, I would suspect they're going to have to figure out, are they really going to want to go take this public? I mean, the Republicans, or are they going to try to do a deal with Trump?
Now, one of the things that Vindman testified yesterday was that there were parts of the conversation that were not included in the rough transcript. Take a listen to President Trump earlier this month. He was talking about the rough transcript and how it exonerates him.
This is an exact word-for-word transcript of the conversation, right? Taken by very talented stenographers.
So that's not true. We knew it at the time it was not true, and now we know that parts were left out, parts that Vindman have said were not necessarily left out nefariously, but he did try to get put back in and was not able to do.
Right, that he tried to make these key corrections on multiple times, and that on multiple times some got inserted and then some didn't. But you know, one of the big key pieces of moving forward for Democrats, and back to the whole element of public testimony and Taylor, is that they feel as though they don't necessarily need everyone to testify publicly. So being able to land someone like Taylor in a public testimony, they will be pretty happy with that. And then maybe one or two others, because they don't want this to drag out longer than it needs to, and they do want to start getting to those, as well as having private depositions at the same time.
And Caitlin, a source says that Vindman testified it was this portion where President Trump mentions the tapes of Biden where stuff was left out about Burisma and investigations. Biden went around, this is Trump in the part of the rough transcript that was released. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, ... You see the ellipses highlighted there. It sounds horrible to me. The White House originally said that was just because the conversation had trailed off, but that's apparently not true.
And this is the contradiction that needs to be explained, because when this transcript came out and you saw those ... people asked, was something there? What happened? They said no, it was just where there was a pause in the conversation, someone trailed off. They said if there had been words left out, there would have been brackets in place. That was the White House who put that out. And even though on the transcript it says this is not a verbatim transcript, it did say that. And while our reporting so far has shown that Vindman did not testify that there was some kind of sinister motive behind why this was left out, there have been questions about why exactly. And some people have speculated that potentially it's because this was that transcript that was moved so quickly to that secure system. And it took about a matter of days based on what our sources have told us. So those are the questions for the White House to explain why did they say that if there actually were words that were left out.
But that's also not how the process works.
But also to speak to the idea that there is no nefarious motive, the rough transcript as it existed was damning.
Yes.
So the president didn't think so.
But I think the cover-up did not succeed.
So everyone stick around. We've got a lot more to talk about. We have to sneak in a quick break. The powder keg. Before the call, new details today about the explosive Ukraine meeting at the White House and why it could be the key moment to the impeachment probe. Stay with us.
President Trump's controversial July 25th phone call with the Ukrainian president that sparked the impeachment inquiry. The rift over Ukraine spilled out in a series of White House meetings. On July 10th, Ukraine's Secretary of National Security and Defense Counsel traveled to Washington to meet with then National Security Advisor John Bolton, then Special Envoy to Ukraine Kurt Volker, Ambassador to the EU Gordon Sondland, and Energy Secretary Rick Perry. U.S. career national security officials who are experts on Ukraine and Russia, Fiona Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, were also there. In public, it was all smiles. Perry tweeted a picture of the delegation. The Americans heaped praise on their Ukrainian counterparts, tweeting, "Great discussion, good teamwork, we stand with Ukraine." Privately, though, things were going sour. The Ukrainians were angling for an in-person meeting between newly elected President Zelensky and President Trump, an important sign of solidarity between the U.S. and Ukraine as the country continued to face threats from Russia. Ambassador Sondland started to speak about Ukraine delivering specific investigations in order to secure the meeting with the president, at which time Ambassador Bolton cut the meeting short. Vindman, the White House's expert on Ukraine, testified Tuesday.
I want to thank Colonel Vindman for his courage in coming forward.
After Bolton cut off the meeting, there was another meeting where Sondland talked with the Ukrainians and pressed once again for the political investigations Trump was demanding. Vindman testified. Ambassador Sondland emphasized the importance that Ukraine deliver the investigations into the 2016 election, the Bidens, and Burisma. Then Vindman and Hill confronted Sondland. I stated to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate, that the request to investigate Biden and his son had nothing to do with national security, and that such investigations were not something the NSC was going to get involved in or push, Vindman testified. Dr. Hill then entered the room and asserted to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate.
He heard Ambassador Sondland tell the Ukrainians that to get a White House meeting that they needed to deliver on investigations into Vice President Biden. That, Anderson, is a this for that. In other words, a quid pro quo.
But Sondland offered investigators a different version of events, testifying if Ambassador Bolton, Dr. Hill, or others harbored any misgivings about the propriety of what we were doing, they never shared those misgivings with me, then or later. He also said he was not aware that Burisma, the Ukrainian energy company Hunter Biden served on the board of, was connected to the Bidens until much later.
This is easy,
Now, after all of this went down, John Bolton reportedly told Fiona Hill he didn't want to be part of whatever drug deal Gordon Sondland and Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney were cooking up. Now, impeachment committees say they are ready to hear from John Bolton. They want to speak to him next week. Jake.
I'm guessing he didn't mean drug deal as a compliment. Sarah Murray, thanks so much. Caitlin, so National Security Advisor fired National Security Advisor John Bolton, although he says he resigned, we should point out. He holds a lot of cards here, and now he's been invited to testify.
Yeah, scorned might be the more appropriate word for him. That's what people are going to be watching because, of course, he played a direct role in all of this. He was at the center of this fight, pushing for the aid to be released, locked in this feud with Mick Mulvaney, the Chief of Staff, which we didn't understand at the time. As far as whether or not he's going to show up, keep in mind he is the same attorney as his deputy, Charlie Kupperman, who took over when he was fired/resigned. And that attorney has filed this lawsuit essentially asking a court to rule whether or not he has to show up, ignoring the White House's mandate that they defy it and don't show up. We're still waiting on a ruling on that. So maybe Bolton will follow that path.
And the fact that this meeting took place in July, according to Vindman, where we now know Ukrainians were told, according to Sondland, if you go by Vindman's testimony, if you want this meeting at the White House, you have to do these investigations. That's pretty much a direct assertion of a quid pro quo or alleged extortion even, right to the Ukrainians.
Yeah, and there is distance between those two. I assume we'll hear from Sondland again and get more questions for him. And who knows what will happen with Bolton? Hell hath no fury like a power stash scorned. You know, like he might show up. Really.
I've never heard that one before.
That's a famous quote.
It's a lesser known aphorism. So, Karen, here's how the Washington Post described it. Quote, the West Wing meetings on July 10th increasingly appear to mark the moment of detonation of the Ukraine crisis inside the White House. Though by then, Bolton, Vindman, then White House Russia advisor Fiona Hill and others had become suspicious that Trump was pursuing a secret agenda. And then, look, maybe it's entirely unrelated, but Fiona Hill and John Bolton didn't last that much longer in the administration.
I'm sure that was totally a coincidence.
Yeah.
You know, here's what's so important about that Washington Post story. In addition to the details that we learned from that story and we're hearing today, again, this narrative is starting to lay itself out, right? We now know July 25th, which we always sort of knew, wasn't the only time this conversation was had. Now we know there were other meetings. Now we know about what was happening on July 10th. It is reasonable to assume that there was potentially prior to that there was more conversation. It didn't just occur to someone, you know, one day, hey, let's do this. You have to suspect that he would have would have had this idea in his head right from the time they got a new prime minister in Ukraine.
And what's the defense of this? What are people, Republicans on the Hill, Republicans in the White House saying, other than, you know, attacking those who are, you know, making these allegations and depositions, impugning their patriotism, et cetera? How do you defend the fact that Gordon Sondland, the president's point man on Ukraine, the shadow Ukraine policy, is stating specifically, according to Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, there needs to be a quid pro quo?
Whenever they've been faced with that question or they've been asked, look, there's evidence piling up that is showing that there were quid pro quos, multiple ones. That's what Taylor testified to. And then Republicans say, that's not a quid pro quo. I don't see a quid pro quo in that. Or they just continue to attack the democratic process, the process that Democrats are using. They don't really dive into the substance, and they say that they believe that the president hasn't done anything wrong, and they deflect consistently, or they say that Democrats need to bring this out into the public. And we'll see whether or not their arguments hold once this moves into the public
the
realm.
process argument becomes moot. It was an easier argument to make for a while, and it was sort of a placeholder, so you don't have to deal with the substance as much. But once it comes out in public, Republicans will have to deal with that, and those talking points have to change.
With no help from Trump, because there is no, unlike we had in the Clinton administration, where we did have a war room, we were proud of it, we had a message that went out. They will be having to survive by tweet. So they're not even going to have a strategy. They're going to have to make sense of what they are going to say, not with any coordination with the White House, because who knows what's in Trump's head.
So Jonah Goldberg, who writes for The Dispatch and has also written for National Review, wrote a piece basically saying what President Trump needs to do is what President Clinton did, which is apologize. And then well, you're way ahead of me. You're way ahead of me,
Okay.
Caitlin. Apologize, because if the president said, look, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have done it, whatever. I'm not saying this is Jonah's argument. But the reason you're making these expressions that I don't know if you've ever seen on TV is because he just doesn't do that, President Trump.
The president doesn't apologize, and he famously is proud of the fact that he doesn't apologize. I mean, you can count on one hand since he's entered this political arena that he was in right before he became president. He's not someone who apologizes. The one time he famously did apologize was over the Access Hollywood tape, something he later took back. He told people he regretted and then said he didn't believe it was his voice on that tape. So essentially, this is not how the president operates. So the idea that he would do that is just, it's not his mentality. He thinks that apologizing is a sign of weakness, that if you do, in a sense, is an admission of guilt. And I think the Republican view, the White House view, is that even if he did apologize, it wouldn't change things, the dynamic with Democrats, so they wouldn't really see the point of the president doing
But
it.
might not change public opinion?
Potentially, although it appears as though a lot of the public feels that this investigation should go on, whether or not he should be impeached. So that will, Democrats have the wind at their backs. The train has left the station, as Caitlin said, and I think that there's nothing that's going to stop them from pulling on the threads.
All right, everyone, stick around. We've got more to talk about.
Room with Wolf Blitzer. Up next on CNN.
International lead. When a U.S. service member is killed in the line of duty, the U.S. government promises to take care of his or her family with a monthly payment. That Gold Star family is also then eligible to receive part of an insurance plan if they have been paying into it. But there's a catch. For every dollar that the grieving family receives from one plan, the U.S. government holds back $1 from the other. It's called the widow's tax. And right now, Congress could end it, though it's not clear if they will. Joining me now to talk about it, Democratic Senator Doug Jones of Alabama. He's a lead sponsor of legislation to repeal the widow's tax. We also have with us an old friend of mine, Gold Star wife, Kristen Fenty, her husband, Army Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fenty, was killed in action in Afghanistan in 2006. Kristen, it's great to see you again. For people who may not have heard of the widow's tax before, explain how this affects your family, you and your daughter.
Okay. My husband served 20 years in the U.S. military and had earned a retirement, but was not retired. He was killed in Afghanistan, and in the days following his death, in fact, before he was buried, I was asked to make a selection about how I would receive my daughter's benefit, receive the survivor benefit attached to his retirement, and it was rather confusing to me. In fact, when they said we're here to discuss survivor issues, my heart leapt because I thought they meant there were survivors, but no. It was the survivor benefits, and essentially my husband's benefit is offset by $1,319 a month. I had the choice to take the benefit in my name for my life with an offset, or take it in my daughter's name until she reached the age of majority or graduated from college. I actually did a break-even analysis, and I think the break-even for me, because my husband had been in so long and earned a higher retirement, was like age 72. But there were VSOs who said to me, Kristen, there's strong legislation on the Hill. It's going to pass in this session. Take the benefit in your daughter's name. It will revert to your name, and you'll have it for life.
You were told this in 2006, the legislation.
In 2006.
And here's the thing. For 18 years, people have been trying to get legislation like the kind you have introduced passed into law, and it hasn't happened. Why do you think this time it might?
I think this time because we've got overwhelming bipartisan support. There's 76 co-sponsors in the Senate, 3/4 of the United States Senate, 381 in the House. It was passed and put in as part of the House National Defense Authorization. It's in conference now. Last week, a couple of weeks ago, we passed a resolution in the Senate that passed 94-0, instructing the folks in the Senate to put it in the NDAA. It would have passed 100-0, but I got a few folks out running around in Iowa and New Hampshire. But it has got overwhelming support. Everybody, I think now, Jake, recognizes that for 40 years, we have neglected our duty and our obligation to the very people that served us and gave us their all.
And let's point out that one of the reasons you guys are here right now is because we want there to be awareness for people who are working behind closed doors on this national defense bill that this is an issue that could be resolved. For people out there who don't understand, Kristen, What do you wish they understood about this? That people don't know about the widow's tax. What do they need to know?
Well, they need to know that it's an earned and purchased benefit. It's earned through years of service and deferred compensation contributions while on active duty. And post-retirement, retirees can elect to participate in an insurance plan where they pay a premium to ensure that the retirement benefit provide a survivor annuity to their families.
In other words, this isn't free goodies that you want from the federal government. This is stuff that you and your husband earn.
It's earned and it's purchased. And it's being offset purely because our spouses died as the result of service. The benefit that is paid to survivors for the loss of their spouses in service is paid in order to hold the government harmless. It's an
publicly.
Yeah, so we are learning from a source close with Bill Taylor that he is willing to go up to the Hill again, this time for an open hearing. Now, he has not gotten a formal request from the committees for this. Tomorrow, they are going to vote on some of the rules for what this will actually look like, but he's willing to, and that is key here because he is the person who told lawmakers that he was told by the U.S. ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, that everything with regard to Ukraine was dependent on Zelensky publicly stating that he would investigate 2016 and the Bidens, therefore laying out the most compelling argument that there was a quid pro quo at play. But the thing here is that Bill Taylor is not at all a political character. He's served under both the Trump administration, former Democratic administrations, Republican administrations, and he is viewed by Democrats as rock solid. That's because he is a note taker and he was someone who has provided the most compelling details to date with regard to the Trump administration policy in Ukraine.
He has the receipts, so to speak. And as part of your reporting, you also have some new material as far as what Taylor testified regarding quid pro quo.
Yeah, so the Democrats are trying to pin down these folks who are going up to the Hill on if there was a quid pro quo based on what they saw. And so Bill Taylor was asked specifically if there was a quid pro quo, because the person who asked the question said, listen, what you are saying here is that the deal was that Zelensky would announce these investigations related to Biden in 2016, and in return, he would be getting a meeting at the White House and the lift on the security assistance to Ukraine. And Taylor said, yes, that is exactly what I'm laying out here. The person then followed up and said, isn't that the definition of quid pro quo? But Bill Taylor was not willing to go there. He said to the lawmakers, I don't speak Latin. He said he was a person who was there to provide the facts, and it is lawmakers who are in the role that are supposed to be the ones who are determining the legal definitions here, and if there was quid pro quo at play. Brooke?
Okay. Kylie, stand by. I may want to bring you into my next bigger conversation. Francesca Chambers is with me here in Washington. She's a White House correspondent from McClatchy, D.C. Kim Whaley was associate independent counsel in the Whitewater investigation of President Clinton. She is also the author of How to Read the Constitution and Why. And also here, CNN legal analyst Michael Zeldin. He's a former federal prosecutor. And so, Michael, starting with you. Kylie ran through it a bit, but just remind everyone, when this thing becomes public and when Bill Taylor testifies, what is the most damning piece of information he may say that the whole world can see?
That the President of the United States corruptly used the powers of his office for personal gain. That's the narrative that the Democrats need to say for America to be convinced that this was an impeachable offense. Quid pro quo is lovely. If there is something for something that makes it criminal-like, fine. But even if there was no quid pro quo, if the President of the United States is corruptly using the powers of his office for personal political gain, dirt on the Bidens, that in and of itself is the type of abuse of office that the Founding Fathers had in mind when the Constitution was enacted.
Okay, so on the one hand, yes, potentially damning. On the other hand, we're getting reporting also from Kylie that the Republicans are going to change up their counterpunch, right? So instead of saying, not really liking the process, this isn't transparent, Democrats basically like, well, okay, we're opening the doors. Now the Republicans are going to say, well, a number of these diplomats are sort of second-degree separation